Dr. Martin, Christine Kushner, Chris Haggerty, Ms. Mahaffey, Ms. Carter, and myself, all here. And we're going to start finance today. Today should be an interesting day in finance. We have a couple housekeeping things to take care of first, and then as we start our finance or our budget process now, it's going to be probably a tougher year than ever to be looking at our budget and all the things that have been one-time expenditures now being recurring expenses. And as we move forward, we're going to have to be very diligent on how we want to prioritize our needs in our school system. So I look forward to that process. So I think I'll start with, of course, the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
Ms. Cash, I move we adopt the minutes from the last meeting.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion from Mr. Haggerty and a second from Dr. Martin to approve those minutes. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And now I think, Mr. Winters, do you have a recommendation for the audit committee?
Thank you, Ms. Cash. As you remember, in probably October or November, we asked for recommendations for the audit committee. We received one that was in time for the finance committee meeting, and one came in a little bit later. So we have not had a meeting since that time, since November. So we are now bringing a new recommendation. Part of the requirement for the audit committee is that the individuals either involved in, as a lawyer, perhaps financial investments, finance, CPAs, accountants, MBAs. And if you look in your attachment, we have an individual that Mr. Haggerty has recommended. And I guess I'll turn it over to Mr. Haggerty as it's his recommendation to speak to this candidate.
Thank you, Mr. Winters. Ms. Shake is a candidate who has approached us, who has had interest in serving on our audit committee. She's been active in calendar issues and academic issues with the schools and with different civic organizations around the district. She comes from a background in pharma, but has worked in capital budgets, capital budget coordinator for Lenovo, similar accounting positions, accounting liaison positions for Fortune 500 companies. She's not necessarily an accountant by trade, but does come with a strong budgeting background and seemed like she could present a very useful perspective for us.
Yes, her background certainly meets the requirements of our board policy supporting the audit committee. So what we're asking today is if you agree to move this name forward, we will bring it to the next board meeting as a consent item for a vote to add this individual to the audit committee.
Does everybody, and this doesn't take a motion then from the finance, it's just.
Does anybody object?
Does anybody object? Thank you, Ms. Thank you. Does anybody object to this recommendation for nomination? Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you all. I appreciate your support of the nominee.
Thank you, Mr. Haggerty, for bringing that forward. Sounds like a very good candidate. Okay, now we move to our agenda, and Mr. Nieder.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Cash. And what we'd like to do now is use pretty much the remainder of the Finance Committee. Start with a very brief presentation, just a handful of slides, sharing with you the general landscape and background as we see it as we enter into the 2022-2023 budget development cycle. And then we're going to ask that you break into two small groups and have some discussion. I'll outline what that looks like in the few slide presentation. And then after that discussion, have each of the two groups report back out. As Ms. Cash said, this is going to be a challenging budget cycle, and from my perspective, for a number of different reasons. We've got that fiscal cliff that we're facing 2 years out. We're starting a little bit later than normal because we didn't even have a state budget until 6 months into the fiscal year, and some other things. But I can't remember a budget cycle that hasn't been challenging. So I'm confident working together, we will get through this and to the other side, but there will be some difficult decisions ahead. So with that being said, if I could ask Donna or Sharon, if you could pull up the PowerPoint deck, please.
I don't want to mention that Ms. Johnson-Hassler just joined us, so we have full board here for the finance meeting today.
Okay, and next slide, please. So I pretty much covered this slide. So next slide, please. So as I said, we are starting later than normal. From a state budget perspective, the state has already set out a budget for the 2022-2023 year in their biennial budget. And they did that during the long session this past season. So that state budget is already established. That being said, when they do come back into session for the short session this spring, they could change it or make, amendments to it. But we know what it says at this point. We know that there are included in that second year of the biennial budget with the state compensation increases for certified staff, school administrators, and support staff. And again, the question is, what, if any, changes will the state make? We now have, in recent weeks, some additional economic uncertainty added to our landscape with world events going on. Thus far, there have been limited impacts on the U.S. and European economies. Most of the impact has been on the ruble up to now and its value, but that could change. So we're going to have to keep our eye on world events because it can change things right here at home. If we could go to the next slide. You'll recall that we've already committed $13 million of funding that we don't have in order to continue that $15 per hour support staff minimum for a full year in the coming year. We implemented that effective January 1st of this year for 6 months. That's all the funding we had to put towards it. But knowing in order to continue that ongoing on an annual basis, we will need an estimated $13.5 million of additional local funding in the coming year.
And Mr. Nieder, can you confirm, is that assuming the state stays where they're at, or is it assuming the state follows their current statement of moving toward 15?
Dr. Martin, good question. And the $13 million estimate assumes that the state does move to $15 per hour, and effectively for state-funded employees picks up the cost of that.
Okay, so that is our base. It could be more.
It could be more. It could be, I believe, the other estimate without the state moving to 15 was more in the $20-some million range.
Thank you.
We're opening 4 new schools this coming year. And there are all the operating costs, utilities, groundskeeping, custodial, other maintenance costs. Some other costs that are locally borne of operating those schools. And because we're currently in a county where parts are growing rapidly and more rapidly than others, even though our student counts aren't growing significantly, we're still having to open new schools to accommodate the growth in those areas. And those come with costs that are not funded by the state. They are intended to be locally funded. There'll be the local costs associated with all the state legislation. And there is, as I've said, the fiscal cliff. We currently have, and I believe at your next Finance Committee meeting, we're going to give you an update on the ESSER and other federal funding that we've received as a part of the pandemic. But we've got in the neighborhood of $35 million of recurring expenditures currently on this federal funding, which will expire in 2 years. So that's something we're going to have to address, beginning in the 2022-23 budget. Next slide, please. We've also got the multi-year initiatives, which we began pre-pandemic. We more or less had to put them on pause the first year of the pandemic due to the economic uncertainty, but they were back in our budget for the current year, and we want to continue our focus on supporting these efforts as well. And the primary multi-year initiatives that have currently been established are support staff compensation, bring our maintenance and operations for our facilities funding to a national standard formula, increasing the number of social emotional learning positions significantly, and increasing the number of instructional support technicians. Those are all part of the multi-year initiative, and both one could say that all of these have been impacted by the pandemic. And when I say impacted, not because of the year we had to back off working on these, but our need for instructional support technicians is greater now than ever, because as a result of the pandemic, we're basically a one-to-one district. We were not that pre-pandemic. The SEL positions, everybody knows that the pressure the pandemic has put on that. Same thing with the cleaning and disinfecting of our buildings. That's put additional pressure on our M&O operation as well. So these all remain very important, perhaps more important as a result of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So just a couple last things to think about as we look at the landscape entering into this budget cycle. There is currently planned a bond referendum planned for the fall election, such that the county could issue general obligation bonds rather than limited obligation bonds for the next round of CIP funding. General obligation bonds come with the benefit of slightly lower interest rates, so a lower cost to the county and the taxpayers, but they do require a referendum. And so the question to think about there from the county's perspective is, will there be a tax increase required? And if so, would that tax increase be revenue neutral or not? And I'll also point out, I believe for both boards, the Board of Commissioners and the Board of Education, all members are up, at least under current legislation, up for re-election. So I just share that as part of the landscape as well. A large part of the superintendent's and then the board's proposed budget really drills down on what the request of the county commissioners is, because as far as the state is concerned, whatever they legislate is what we receive, and we just have to estimate what we believe they're going to do based upon existing legislation and what we think they may change or add to it in order to estimate what our overall budget looks like and the associated local costs would be with any of that legislation. Next slide, please. So keeping in mind that any additional local funding for this coming year will not be infinite, it will be finite. And keeping in mind that the needs of the district are significant and have remained significant and will remain significant for a lot of different reasons I won't go into at this point. But when you break out in the small groups, we'd like you to discuss, of all these priorities, which of them rise to the top. And then I'm going to hand out a sheet after you break out, which summarizes some of the information on the prior slides and gives you some other numbers to kind of play with, as this is what we think, this is what legislative impact might cost the district in the coming year. This is what program continuity might cost in the coming year. And everyone's been through a cycle at this point, so I think you're familiar with those categories. But we're going to break you up into two groups of four. I think Ms. Cash will do that. And then have you spend whatever time we have, allowing enough time for reporting out, discussing these competing needs. And that's part of the challenge, but that's where we're looking for your input as well as any input that is not contained within these slides and comes out in your discussion.
How long would we have for this breakout group? You might have said that and I missed it.
Well, we've got till 4 o'clock. It's 3:20, let's say, so we've got 40 minutes. 20 minutes for...
You're going to have them all break out, 20 or 25, yeah.
25 minutes for breakout, and then reporting out, and then a few minutes to close.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
So I will, Ms. Cash, let you work out how you would like the logistics to be.
Well, I think we have plenty of room here, so we might want to go. Group 1 could go over here and Group 2 over there. Group 1 is myself and Christine Kushner, Heather Scott, Lindsay Mahaffey. Group 2 is Karen Carter, Jim Martin, Chris Haggerty, and Monica Johnson-Hostler. So maybe Group 2 come there and Group 1 come here. And as he said, you'll have Mr. Nieder, did you give the sheets out, or you're just going to give them out now? Okay, you'll have a sheet to follow to kind of look at some of the pieces, and one person in your group can report back about some priorities that the group of you have decided are important for us as we move forward. Thank you.
No, Christine said go find some money. I said I have $11. I gotta walk next door for 1 second. I'll be right back.
charter. They're the ones where the principal, the one, husband manages the contract and the services, contract. All the property. And their daughter, and they, those are what Oh, I knew they took it. All right, so back to this, back to controlling our dollars. Thank you. Add more work. It's a win-win. Yeah, I can tell them that. I don't think we, I think we did that. Because see, they're friends. They're friends. They're friends. Okay, well, you're on the record with that, Ron. So the state is going to $15. Okay, I trust that they will be, so that's done. They'll go to $15. But they have access to start date of that. Yes, no, that's it. It's with our number. So I think, yeah, but that's our number. And that would be our local. I see. Because that would include our enterprise, our cafeteria workers who no longer live in enterprise. This is that's a different cost. We would assume that enterprise and our friends. Oh, you think that's, if you have to take one of these things off the list, that's gonna be tough.
Dictating it and creating the forms that we have. Instead, it's the laws and the local are driving what we do. And we're comfortable with saying the law can dictate even years. And even employees and even staff employees. Those purposes don't dictate how you get staggered. And so, for the most part, say, hey, we think this is a
Okay, we'll spend the next about 10 minutes. We'll run over a little bit, not much, but I'd like one person from each group to report out some of the priorities they talked about. And
Ms. Cash, I'm happy to share our group
thank you.
summary if you're ready for that. So we had robust discussion, but some of the priorities that our group highlighted that away from the list were arts funding and AIG, as well as marketing. And on the list, we also we're very supportive of the multi-year initiatives, particularly the maintenance and operations, and getting more information about what the national standards are, what that dollar looks like. And I believe we also had asked for more information about the difference in providing the district providing benefits to employees, vision and dental, to find out what those costs might be. That wasn't necessarily a priority above all of this, but just to add that to some of the information we've been looking for. And I realize that's more of a HR question. And I think that summarizes for the most part.
We focus on the staff compensation being important. So the two bullets down below.
Yes.
About those two, plus the 3 items you mentioned. Thank you, Ms. Scott. Yeah. Anybody on the group want to add something to that? Okay, next group.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. I would say that we also had a lot of robust discussion about a lot of issues. I think the one thing that everyone was united on was maintaining staff salaries and wages, and maintaining, what we had adopted was crucial. I think that was the top priority. As we looked at impacts of the pandemic, I think there were continued concerns about mental health and the human services that we deliver. And a lot of these also seem to be aligned with goals the county has in terms of, I guess, human resources and healthcare services. And, the thought was, are there ways that we can work in better partnership with them to deliver some of those services inside our school building? And then I'll let anybody else in the group comment as well on other issues.
I'll just pick up on that one. There's when we look at budgets, we have a tendency to ask for line items, and that makes budget dollar values seem to go up. That only works so far. And so particularly things like the health needs, the social and emotional needs, I think there's a real opportunity for creative approaches that don't look like we've always been doing it. Right? The county already funds nurses. So we don't need that in our budget. It needs to be in the county's budget. The county already has a major social services program, right? If a child needs a social worker, chances are almost 100% that the family does as well. And so the school social worker does the child, and the county social worker does mom and dad. Wait a minute, don't they need to come together? The school is for 9 or 10 months, the family. So the point is, there may be ways there where we can leverage existing services working in partnership, so it's part of our budget, but it's not necessarily a line item. And so I think that, how do we think differently instead of just a budget by line item?
I think that's a good point, because, silos, even in nonprofits, recreate so many different services that they give to the community, and they become silos, and then money is just spent. And that's, I'm sure, similar in human services. Now, the nurses, they only give us a certain number, and they can pull them at any time for what they need them for. So school nurses might still be something we'd have to have them service more of.
We need them to invest in it,
Yes.
whether it's through our budget or their budget. That doesn't matter so much, but we need a nurse in every school.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. And piggybacking on that, I think we also need to think more creatively about how we can recruit and retain our employees. We have, barriers that we have to hiring school counselors, for one example, or social workers. The state requires us to have certain certificates and licenses for them. How can we support those employees in getting those licenses? And how can we help them with their training? Just the way that we're helping our bus drivers get some of their training, can we think creatively about helping, because we have such a need for our social workers, nurses, and counselors and school psychologists. How can we help retain those employees in innovative ways? And that might be a A.J. Matillo question, working with finance, because it will be cheaper and more efficient for us to retain than to lose some folks and have that churn that we've been seeing.
That's a critical sentence right there, what you just said, and you did say it in the group. Cheaper to retain than to recruit.
I'll note one other thing that we talked a lot about, and that is for so many of these things, how we plan and how we articulate our planning is probably as or more important than the specific dollars in any given budget. There's no way we can ask for all the needs that we have, right? And particularly looking at the $35 million with the ESSER funds. If we ask for 5, 10, 15 million this year to help offset that, that just is not going to communicate, because that would be perceived, right? If I ask for another 10 million, then now we have $45 million. What are we going to do with it? It's not like we need that dollar value today. We don't have a bank account that we can put it in for when the car breaks down. We're going to be able to pay for it. But at the same time, so that's a really, really, really high priority, but it's not necessarily a dollars in the budget this year priority. So how do we message getting ready for those issues, right? What are we doing with those $35 million today? Because the public can very easily look at it and say, this was one-time ESSER money because you had special needs. When those needs go away, why do you still need that money? So we need to very clearly articulate what are the recurring things that money is being used for. We don't need that money today, but we're sure going to need it 2 years down the road. How do we articulate that plan? Same with a lot of these other multi-year initiatives. How do we articulate the plan to address them, I think, is almost as important as what the dollars are, as Ms. Carter noted, right? 5 years from now, are we going to be having the same conversation? Or can we look back and say, the plan was put into place, here's what you can expect? I just think we really need to work toward that. We need dollars on the bottom line, but we need a good, effective plan that people can look at and say, if we do this, this is what will happen.
And that's what we started with when we first looked at the multi-year plan, the 5-year plan. We had it broken down. And then I guess things did change. But I think what you said was really important, Dr. Martin. For one thing, in that $35 million fiscal funding cliff, there are some things in that, and Ms. Kinsey will talk to some of us in our group about it, that are SEL instructors or IST that we paid for, and we need to share that $35 million is important to keep these things that have been our priorities. But if we don't tell them that's paying for that, they won't know that. Public won't know that, and we might not know that. So, very well said. Thank you, Dr. Martin. Okay, is there any other input about priorities or funding that board members as groups or individually want to suggest that we let our finance department continue to look at? I think working in groups is always really helpful. Thank you, team, for doing that. I think it's helpful to put us in groups, and it gives us some time to talk over and understand each other well. What will be the timeline at this point?
Well, that actually, Ms. Cash, was the last slide. The slide is in assembly. I'm not going to ask the PowerPoint be brought up, but we do plan to bring the superintendent's proposed budget to you at your first April board meeting.
That's our next marker. Okay. as we think of things, or if board members continue to think of things, that please send them to me and I'll forward them on to finance, and we can all see that at some point. We'll share those items and see how we can do the most we can for the kids of Wake County and our staff. Okay, if there's not, that's all we have today, isn't it, Mr. Nieder? Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
If you two got a minute. Mark, you got a minute?